Bruce Lee is often remembered through an image of control, fast, disciplined, and precise, with movements that appeared effortless and decisions that seemed certain. Every step, every strike, and every idea reflected intention. This image suggests a life guided by clarity and mastery, where nothing was left to chance. Yet beneath that reputation was a moment when determination quietly crossed into excess, and one choice carried consequences that could not be ignored. This was not a dramatic collapse or a public failure, but a subtle turning point. A moment where pushing forward without pause demanded a price, forcing Bruce Lee into stillness he had not planned for. What followed was not defeat, but reflection. Not loss, but change. This story explores that mistake not to diminish his legacy, but to understand how it reshaped his thinking, slowed his pace, and ultimately influenced the path that followed. Bruce Lee believed deeply in progress. For him, growth was not optional, it was a responsibility. He felt that standing still, even briefly, meant losing momentum. This belief shaped how he approached every aspect of his life, especially his training. Each day became an opportunity to improve, refine, and move closer to his ideal of efficiency and control. Bruce Lee was never comfortable repeating the same routines without questioning them. Once something became familiar, he looked for ways to make it more demanding. He believed that the body and mind adapted quickly, and that comfort was a sign it was time to raise the standard. Training harder and moving faster were not goals on their own, but tools he used to push beyond what he had already achieved. As his reputation grew, so did the weight he carried internally. He knew that people watched him closely, measured his abilities, and compared him to others. This awareness created a quiet pressure to remain ahead. He felt an unspoken obligation to prove that his methods worked and that his discipline was justified. Falling behind was not something he allowed himself to consider. This pressure influenced how he interpreted fatigue. Instead of seeing tiredness as a signal to pause, he often viewed it as something to overcome. Pain and discomfort were treated as barriers that could be trained through, rather than warnings to slow down. In his mind, endurance was closely linked to progress, and stopping felt like giving ground. During this period, Bruce Lee began exploring new ways to increase strength and speed. He was fascinated by the idea of combining different training methods to create greater results. Weight training, cardiovascular work, flexibility exercises, and technical practice were often compressed into long, demanding sessions. He believed that by challenging multiple systems at once, he could accelerate improvement. These routines were intense and required enormous effort. High repetitions, heavy resistance, and minimal breaks became common. Training days were packed, leaving little room for rest. Recovery was often pushed aside, not out of ignorance, but because it felt unproductive. Time spent resting was time not spent improving. Bruce Lee trusted his awareness and discipline to guide him safely through this intensity. He believed that his understanding of his body would allow him to recognize limits before real harm occurred. This confidence made it easier to push further, even when signs of strain began to appear. The idea of slowing down felt uncomfortable to him. Slowing down suggested stagnation, and stagnation felt like failure. This mindset quietly shaped how far he was willing to go. The drive to improve was sincere and focused, but it also narrowed his perspective. Balance began to take second place to momentum. Bruce Lee's commitment to progress was absolute. Every session was treated as an investment in mastery. However, the pressure to keep advancing left little room for pause. What began as dedication slowly became excess, setting the stage for a lesson that would soon demand his attention. The mistake Bruce Lee made was not rooted in arrogance or carelessness. It came from something far more subtle and understandable: deep confidence in his discipline and self-awareness. Bruce Lee believed strongly in the connection between mind and body. He trusted that focus, intention, and control could guide him safely through extreme effort. This belief had served him well for many years, reinforcing his sense that limits could be approached thoughtfully without serious risk. This confidence slowly shifted into overestimation. Bruce Lee began to assume that because he understood his body better than most, he could push it further without consequence. He believed that awareness would always arrive before damage, and that willpower could compensate for strain. This assumption became the foundation of his mistake. Instead of viewing physical limits as fixed boundaries, he saw them as flexible lines that could be moved through training. While this mindset encouraged growth, It also blurred an important distinction. There is a difference between challenging the body and overwhelming it. Bruce Lee believed that careful attention would keep him on the right side of that line, but the body does not always communicate clearly or immediately. As training intensity increased, small warning signs began to appear. Fatigue lingered longer than usual, muscles remained tight instead of recovering fully. Movements required more effort than before. These signs were not dramatic, but they were persistent. For many people, they would have been signals to reduce intensity or rest. For Bruce Lee, they became challenges to overcome. Pain and discomfort were reframed as tests of discipline rather than messages from the body. He believed that mastering discomfort was part of mastery itself. This perspective made it easier to ignore what his body was trying to communicate. Each time he pushed through strain without immediate consequence, his confidence in doing so increased. Another factor in this mistake was momentum. Once a demanding routine becomes normal, stepping back feels unnatural. Bruce Lee had built a rhythm of constant effort, and altering that rhythm felt like interruption. Slowing down required questioning a system that had produced results, and that questioning did not come easily. He also underestimated the importance of recovery. Rest was viewed as passive, while training felt active and productive. Yet recovery is not an absence of progress. It is part of progress. By neglecting recovery, the body was denied the time it needed to repair and adapt. This imbalance quietly accumulated beneath the surface. The mistake was not a single decision, but a pattern. Each choice to push a little further, rest a little less, and dismiss a small warning added up. Eventually, the difference between controlled challenge and physical harm became too narrow to maintain. Bruce Lee crossed that line without realizing it. What he intended as disciplined effort became excessive strain. The cost did not appear immediately, but it became unavoidable. This moment revealed a truth that even the most focused individuals must face. Understanding and willpower do not eliminate physical limits. They must work alongside respect for the body, not against it. This mistake was deeply human. It came from commitment, not neglect, from belief, not ignorance. And it set the stage for a lesson that would reshape how Bruce Lee understood strength, balance, and mastery. The consequences did not arrive in a dramatic or sudden way. Instead, they emerged quietly, building until they could no longer be ignored. An injury forced Bruce Lee into a state he was unfamiliar with and unprepared for: stillness. For someone whose life revolved around movement, this change was profound. Simple actions that once felt natural became limited. Movements that required no thought now demanded caution. Training, which had been part of his daily rhythm, was suddenly unavailable to him. The absence of physical practice left a noticeable gap, not just in his schedule, but in his sense of self. Bruce Lee had always expressed himself through motion. His ideas, emotions, and discipline flowed through movement. Being unable to train created a sense of separation between who he was and how he lived. This disconnect was deeply unsettling. Without physical expression, he was left face to face with silence and constraint. The injury did more than interrupt his routine. It challenged his understanding of discipline. For years, he had believed that awareness and mental control could guide the body safely through extreme effort. Now, that belief was tested. Rest was no longer a choice, but a requirement. Being forced to slow down revealed a difficult truth. No amount of focus or determination could bypass physical limits. The body has its own language, and ignoring it carries consequences. This realization did not diminish his discipline, but it reshaped it. During recovery, Bruce Lee experienced frustration and impatience. He was accustomed to progress through effort, yet effort now had to be replaced with restraint. This shift required a different kind of strength. Learning to wait tested him in ways that intense training never had. The injury also introduced vulnerability. Being unable to rely on his physical ability created uncertainty. It forced him to confront the reality that mastery is not absolute. Control has boundaries, and respecting those boundaries is part of wisdom. This period stripped away the illusion that discipline alone could solve everything. It revealed that true discipline includes knowing when to stop. Recovery became a lesson in balance, reminding him that progress is not always forward motion. The price he paid was not just physical discomfort, it was the challenge of redefining strength. Instead of measuring ability by output and intensity, he was pushed to consider sustainability and care. This shift would influence how he approached training, teaching, and life moving forward. In Stillness, Bruce Lee discovered a deeper form of awareness, one that did not rely on motion or exertion. This experience, though difficult, became a turning point. It taught him that respecting the body is not a limitation, but a foundation for lasting mastery. During recovery, Bruce Lee faced something that challenged him more deeply than physical pain: inactivity. For most of his life, movement had been constant. Training structured his days, gave direction to his energy, and served as his primary way of understanding himself. When that movement was taken away, time felt unfamiliar and difficult to manage. Without training to occupy his body, Bruce Lee was forced to sit with stillness. At first, this stillness felt uncomfortable and unnatural. His instincts pushed him toward action, but action was no longer available. The body demanded rest, and ignoring that demand was no longer possible. This created a sense of inner tension, where discipline had to be expressed not through effort, but through restraint. As days passed, Bruce Lee began to redirect his focus inward. Reading became a way to explore ideas he previously approached through physical practice. Writing allowed him to organize thoughts that had long remained unspoken. Reflection filled the space that training once occupied. This shift was not immediate or easy, but it slowly became necessary. In Stillness, distractions fell away. Without the physical outlet of training, Bruce Lee could no longer avoid deeper questions. He began examining the beliefs that had guided his behavior for years. One of the most important questions surfaced gradually. Why was he always pushing forward? Was constant effort truly a sign of strength? Or had it become a habit that prevented balance? He realized that pushing endlessly had become part of his identity. Effort felt safe because it was familiar. Slowing down required uncertainty. Stillness demanded honesty. Without movement, there was no way to measure progress in the usual sense. This forced him to rethink how he defined growth. Bruce Lee began to see that discipline had two sides. One side involved effort, repetition, and challenge. The other involved patience, awareness, and listening. He recognized that he had mastered the first side while neglecting the second. This imbalance had contributed to his injury, not because his intentions were wrong, but because his approach lacked completeness. This period of reflection exposed a subtle truth. Constant motion can sometimes be a form of avoidance. By always pushing, it is possible to avoid confronting limits, fear, or imbalance. Stillness removes that escape. It forces attention inward, where discomfort cannot be outrun. Bruce Lee also began questioning how much of his drive came from internal purpose versus external pressure. Reputation, expectation, and comparison had quietly influenced how hard he pushed himself. In Stillness, those voices became clearer. He could see how easily discipline can shift into compulsion when identity becomes tied to performance. Writing helped him process these realizations. Putting thoughts into words slowed them down and gave them shape. He explored ideas about efficiency, simplicity, and sustainability. These ideas would later influence how he trained and taught, but at this moment, they served as tools for understanding himself. Reading exposed him to perspectives beyond physical mastery. Philosophy, psychology, and reflection offered language for experiences he had previously expressed only through movement. These influences deepened his understanding of balance and helped him see discipline as something broader than effort alone. Stillness also changed his relationship with time. Without training sessions to divide the day, moments stretched longer. This allowed for patience to develop. Instead of measuring worth through productivity, Bruce Lee learned to observe without judgment. This was not passive waiting, but active awareness. He began to accept that rest was not failure. It was a necessary phase of growth. This acceptance did not weaken his discipline. It refined it. He understood that pushing forward without pause eventually leads to collapse, while progress guided by awareness leads to longevity. This confrontation with stillness marked a turning point. Bruce Lee emerged with a deeper understanding of discipline, one that included effort and rest, action and restraint. He learned that balance is not the absence of drive, but the ability to direct it wisely. In this quiet period, away from movement and performance, Bruce Lee developed a more complete view of mastery, one that respected the body, honored the mind, and acknowledged that true strength includes knowing when to stop. When Bruce Lee eventually returned to training, he did not return as the same person. The injury had not weakened his discipline, but it had reshaped it. He no longer saw training as something that needed to be heavier, harder, or more extreme to be effective. Instead, he began to question whether excess effort had ever truly been the answer. One of the most important changes was his emphasis on efficiency. Bruce Lee started to value how little energy was needed to achieve a result, rather than how much effort could be applied. He became more interested in removing unnecessary movement than adding more force. This approach required greater awareness, not less. It demanded precision, timing, and understanding rather than endurance alone. He realized that power does not come from strain, but from alignment. When the body moves efficiently, strength flows naturally without resistance. This idea shifted how he trained. Sessions became more focused and intentional. Instead of exhausting himself, he paid closer attention to posture, balance, and coordination. Every movement had a purpose. This change also affected how Bruce Lee viewed longevity. He understood that mastery could not exist without sustainability. Training that damages the body may produce short-term results, but it cannot support long-term growth. He began to think beyond immediate improvement and toward lifelong practice. This perspective encouraged moderation, patience, and adaptability. Adaptability became central to his philosophy. Bruce Lee recognized that the body changes over time and that training must change with it. Stubbornly repeating the same intensity regardless of condition was no longer seen as discipline. True discipline, he realized, involves adjusting intelligently to circumstances. His teaching reflected this shift. Bruce Lee began encouraging students to listen closely to their own bodies rather than imitate extremes. He emphasized awareness over imitation and understanding over blind effort. Students were taught to observe tension, recognize fatigue, and respond appropriately instead of pushing without thought. He also spoke differently about strength. Strength was no longer defined by how much pain one could endure or how long one could push without rest. Instead, it became about sensitivity and perception. Being strong meant noticing imbalance early and correcting it. It meant knowing when to act and when to pause. Bruce Lee often stressed that the body communicates constantly. Ignoring that communication leads to breakdown. Listening to it leads to harmony. This idea became foundational to how he understood mastery. Mastery was no longer about domination, but cooperation between mind and body. This change did not make him less intense. It made him more refined. His training became quieter, but more effective. Movements became smaller, but more precise. Effort became controlled, rather than excessive. In this way, his ability deepened, rather than diminished. The injury had taught him that force without awareness leads to collapse. Awareness without action leads to stagnation. Balance between the two creates growth. This balance became central to how he lived and trained. Bruce Lee's philosophy matured through this experience. He no longer chased limits for their own sake. Instead, he respected them, worked within them, and gradually expanded them with care. This approach allowed progress without self-destruction. The change that followed was not visible in dramatic gestures. It appeared in consistency, clarity, and control. His movements reflected calm confidence rather than urgency. His teaching emphasized understanding rather than proving. In redefining strength, Bruce Lee offered a lesson that extended far beyond martial arts. Strength is not measured by how much one can endure, but by how well one can listen to the body, to the moment, and to reality as it is. This shift marked a deeper level of mastery, one shaped not by force, but by wisdom. The moment that forced Bruce Lee to slow down did not diminish his strength. It clarified it. What began as a mistake became a lesson that reshaped how he understood discipline, effort, and control. Through injury and recovery, he learned that mastery is not built by constant pressure, but by intelligent balance. This story reminds us that progress is not always about pushing harder. Sometimes it is about listening more closely. The body, the mind, and the moment are always communicating, and ignoring those signals comes at a cost. Bruce Lee's growth did not come from avoiding limits, but from respecting them and learning how to move forward without breaking himself in the process. The price he paid gave him something far more valuable than strength alone. It gave him understanding. And that understanding shaped a deeper form of mastery, one rooted not in excess, but in awareness, adaptability, and lasting purpose.